This is America, and this is the Cuban embassy in Washington. It represents a country under one of the world's longest trade embargoes, now being squeezed by a U.S. oil blockade that has pushed the island into near constant blackouts. The Cuban president says this is genocide. The Trump administration has accused Cuba of stoking unrest. Is Washington pressuring a hostile regime into reform or backing a small island into a corner it cannot escape? I'll have more on how we got to this point, but first, here's Alex Marquardt in our Washington, D.C. studio.
Thank you, Matthew. The Trump administration has ramped up its maximum pressure campaign against Cuba by tightening sanctions, targeting Havana's energy supplies, and even issuing a criminal indictment against former President Raul Castro. Supporters say that the tougher approach could help bring political change to the island, while critics argue it is worsening the already terrible humanitarian crisis for ordinary Cubans. Eva McKent has this story.
Thank you guys for coming.
For Jessica Rodriguez, Cuba is family, culture, and identity. Inside her Maryland restaurant, the conversation drifts from food to the future of the island.
Of course, you're always worried about the people, but unfortunately right now, the people are suffering one way or another. They're sometimes going 22 hours straight with no power, electricity, and only running on 1 or 2 hours per day.
That future is once again at the center of Washington's attention. After escalating pressure on Venezuela and starting a war with Iran, the Trump administration signaling Cuba remains in its sights. The White House has expanded sanctions and tightened restrictions on Cuba's access to oil. Administration officials say Cuba continues to wield influence across Latin America, historically maintaining close ties with Venezuela and Nicaragua, while expanding relationships with Russia and China. The Cuban regime's fundamental objective remains the same as it was when Castro first marched into Havana in 1959, a hemispheric Marxist revolution that erases the United States from the earth. A State Department report released this month reads,
"It's just people that don't know what an economy is supposed to look like. They really don't. Because they've always relied on foreign sponsors."
Jessica, who has family on the island, hopes that America's aggression leads to a shakeup in leadership in the country.
A lot of our reaction is finally, it's hopeful that we can finally have change in Cuba.
What the Trump administration does next in Cuba could depend in part on public sentiment. While a majority of Americans have a negative view of Cuba, most do not want to see U.S. military intervention, like troops on the ground. Unlike Venezuela, Cuba's communist government has survived more than 6 decades of American blockades and sanctions. And unlike Iran, it sits just 90 miles from the U.S. state of Florida, making any escalation especially sensitive.
I don't know exactly what the right plan is to make it happen, but we are definitely very hopeful that people are now being aware of just how bad it is and that we can find some kind of policy that can make that change.
Critics, including Democratic lawmakers, United Nations officials, and humanitarian organizations, oppose the administration's strategy, arguing oil restrictions are worsening shortages of electricity, food, and medicine for Cubans and leading to unnecessary deaths. Eva McKent, Aljazeera, Washington.
And joining me now to discuss further is Michael Shifter. He is the former president of the Inter-American Dialogue, and Adolfo Franco, who is a former U.S. foreign policy advisor on Latin America to President George W. Bush. Michael, Adolfo, thank you both for joining me today. Adolfo, I want to start with you. Can you place us in the timeline, if you will, of escalation, of the Trump strategy of squeezing Cuba economically before a possible military action? How far along are we?
Well, we're actually pretty far along when you think about it, because on January 29th, Cuba was declared by the Trump administration as an existential threat under our law. So we've been pretty far along. In May, of course, there was an invocation of a law that we have in the United States that also allows terrorist states to be different sanctions and pressures being applied. We've had the indictments of key officials in Cuba, of course, notably targeting Fidel Castro and so forth.
Raul Castro.
Raul Castro, I'm sorry. And in addition to that, of course, the oil embargo that has been imposed on Cuba and the much more severe restrictions on remittances and the ability under the laws I made reference to for the United States to prohibit transactions by third parties with the Cuban government and its entities that operate tourism and other commercial activities. So if you will use the expression, the screws, they have been tightening, and they're quite significant, and they're being felt by Cuba. And those, I think, will only continue. Secretary Rubio just gave an interview a couple of days ago, and it was very clear that Cuba is now, there's concern about Cuba's use of its very sophisticated espionage activities to promote disruption in the United States through Antifa, influencers, and so forth. Mm-hmm. So we're taking it quite seriously, and the administration is committed to bring about change in Cuba by continuing to put this pressure.
Yeah, Rubio calling Cuba a significant national security threat.
Correct.
Now, I want to talk about that in just a moment. But, Michael, in terms of potential military action, because presumably that's what would come next, or at least eventually, to what extent do you think what's going on in Iran has rejiggered the administration's thinking?
Well, I think there's clearly an impact of Iran. The question is, what is the real effect? And you could argue, on the one hand, that because of the difficulties in Iran, the frustrations with Iran policy is not going too well. That may be tempting to do something in Cuba, following what was deemed a success in Venezuela on January 3rd, the removal of Nicolas Maduro. On the other hand, there are risks in a military option in Cuba. You really don't know what's going to happen. It could produce a lot of chaos, mass migration. It might require a real commitment of the United States and occupation of Cuba and some nation building. And that could be complicated. And so there may be some resistance and reluctance to go that route as well. So I think it could have different effects, and we don't really know which one is most likely.
That is the conventional wisdom, that the success in Venezuela, the removal of Maduro without losing any troops, that buoyed the confidence of Donald Trump and his administration. But Adolfo, explain to us, if you will, why these countries are very different.
Well, I think they are very different. I agree with Michael on this. I actually think it's highly unlikely that the United States will intervene militarily in Cuba. I really do. And that's premised on, this program isn't about the midterms and about the elections and politics, but another foreign intervention after the Iran situation, no matter how Iran turns out, is highly unlikely, in my opinion. And of course, the administration has signaled, and Secretary Rubio and others, that the military option is not being considered. It's all been economic pressure and sanctions to bring about change in Cuba or accelerate it. That's been, and talks are going on with Cuba behind the scenes to that effect. So I don't think that's going to happen, a repeat of that. But there are differences between the two. In the case of Venezuela, particularly, the international community recognized that the Maduro stole the last election and was an illegitimate leader. Now, Havana is an illegitimate government as well. But there was pressure on that, number one, that there was an illegitimate leader and needed to be removed. Also, the Cuban situation, I think, is totally different in this regard. Venezuela, for all the authoritarianism and almost totalitarianism that exists, isn't Cuba quite the communist state that Cuba is. I think military intervention in Cuba would be met with some resistance by Cuba that you did not see in the case of Venezuela. And I think that would be problematic, to say the least. It would have to be a Cuban provocation. They've acquired some drones, we understand, I think 300 drones. I think it's not likely that they would use those drones, and nor will we have that as an excuse to intervene. So short of Cuba doing something, it can't repeat what it did in 1980 with the Mariel orchestrated boat lift to the United States. Short of something of that kind, which was government orchestrated, I don't think the United States is looking to intervene militarily.
What do you think, Michael, that Trump learned in Venezuela that might be shaping how he's approaching Cuba?
Well, I think, again, Venezuela is kind of the template for him. But I think what the United States has to consider, there's no Delcy Rodriguez in Cuba. And they had been working with Delcy Rodriguez before January 3rd and really had confidence in her that she could really manage this situation, which is kind of a much more of a client state, a protectorate, whatever you want to call it in Venezuela. But the U.S., Washington is calling the shots in Venezuela.
So there's no one waiting in the wings as far as the U.S. is concerned?
There's no one waiting in the wings. And I think that reflects, again, the differences, the fundamental difference between Venezuela and and in Cuba. I mean, Venezuela, is a much larger country. It had a much more complicated sort of structures. It had an oil economy. There were deals that were being made even under the Maduro regime. That's very different in Cuba, which has really been deteriorating, which has been decaying economically for a long time.
Can I just add quickly? I agree with that, but I want to add on the political dynamics of why they're two different societies. As much as Maduro dismantled and manipulated the democratic system in Venezuela, there was an opposition party. There's an opposition leader. She won a Nobel Peace Prize. They've had elections. Whether they were manipulated, rigged, and so forth, I think they were. That, of course, has not happened in Cuba for decades. So you had to go back to the early 1950s. So there is a completely different scenario. I'm not saying that Venezuela was a model of democracy by any shape or form, but the idea of the type of opposition that existed in Venezuela, existing in Cuba today, is unthinkable, or that just doesn't work that way. So I think Michael's right. Venezuela was fertile for a deal. Cuba is less so.
I want to remind our viewers some of the things that President Trump has said about Cuba as he ratcheted up his language about the island. Let's take a listen.
All my life I've been hearing about the United States and Cuba. When will the United States do it? I do believe I'll be having the honor of taking Cuba.
Well, look, they're not doing well. Cuba is not doing well. It's a failed nation, and we'll be talking about Cuba at the right time.
On Cuba, are your sanctions on Cuba meant to accelerate its collapse?
No, we just want them to be a nicely run country that can feed its people. Look, it's a failed nation. So we have some very good plans for Cuba. I think, we have to get rid of the regime was very tough, very nasty. The difference is now they don't have money coming in. They had a lot of money coming in from Venezuela. They don't have any money coming. They had oil coming in. They had money coming in. But we're going to take care of Cuba.
Mr. President, sir.
And you know what? They want us to. The people want us there so badly.
So Maduro was removed from Venezuela. Now you have the president talking about taking Cuba, just wanting a nicely run government, ramping up the economic pressure. Michael, isn't this the Trump administration simply saying we get to choose the leaders in this part of the world?
I think there's a lot of that, and I think that's why you see the Cubans resisting, digging in. There's the fundamental. The Cubans want to change. They need a change. They're in desperate straits. I mean, it's never been worse. People are really suffering terribly and living in misery and shortages. But they also have some dignity. They all have a sense of sovereignty. They want to make their own decisions. They want help from the United States. They see Trump as somebody who can help them. But I think that I think what's been striking is that despite all these conversations on changes in the economy, changes in relationships with Russia and China and Cuba, there hasn't been a deal, and both sides seem to be incapable of reaching an agreement, which I think is unfortunate, because I do want to say that I think this is a rare opportunity. The fact that we have a Secretary of State who's the son of Cuban immigrants, I think this is Cuba desperately needs change, and the U.S., I hope, can be helpful in that. But so far, we haven't really seen that coming to fruition.
There's been a phrase that's been coined, the Don Roe Doctrine, a riff on the Monroe Doctrine. So, Adolfo, where does Cuba fit into the Don Roe Doctrine? What's the eventual goal?
Well, I think it fits in this way. So long as we have a country that has served as a proxy for decades and is a spy center for Russia and China and threatens U.S. security, that's what the documents have said in the administration have been. I've been involved in this Cuba stuff for decades, okay, including sensitive information and classified briefings and the rest. I can tell you it's a security threat to the United States. So I disagree with Michael in this regard. I don't think we're about picking leaders. But we're talking about our geopolitical interest and our security interest. We have a lot of differences with Mexican governments, Brazilian governments, leftist governments throughout Latin America, including the former government in Colombia. But we've never talked about invading these countries and taking over Mexico or Brazil or anything else, because they aren't proxies. This is a country that has good relationship with Iran, Hezbollah, does the most sophisticated of espionage operations are conducted by Cuba. There's a famous book, I'm Cuban American, written by a person who's Mario Lasso, was a very famous Cuban lawyer of the 50s. He called it Dagger in the Heart. And Cuban adventurism throughout Latin America during the Castro's period, including even Africa. All of these leftist movements in Latin America were Cuban supported, Cuban centered. Secretary Haig at one time called it, we need to get to the source. So to put Cuba in the category of we just want a different leader or something of that kind, it is a security threat to the United States, and it is proper to be designated as a terrorist state because it does involve itself in terrorist activities.
This seems to be relatively new language, though, from the Trump administration. These comments that Marco Rubio made to Fox News, he said that Cuba is tied to a network of influence operations. He mentioned the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, pro-Hamas, Maduro. He said that there's nothing organic about it. I went back and looked at the last few years of the annual threats reports from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Cuba's hardly mentioned. And when they are, it's in the context of a possible migration crisis. So, Michael, to you, is Cuba as much of a national security threat as the Trump administration is claiming?
Well, I don't have access to the information that Adolfo knows, but I have my doubts. I have serious doubts. What I see is an island that's in terrible straits, that's extremely weak, that can barely function. Its economy can barely function. It's true that it does have intelligence and security. I think our apparatus are pretty much intact. And I think it did pose more of a threat during the 1980s. And you talk about Alexander Haig. We can go back in the last couple of decades. But in 2026, the fact that it poses a national security threat to the United States, I think doesn't strike me as very credible.
Well, I'm going to just add something quickly, if I may, Alex. I don't mean to interrupt. But, I have a lot of respect for Mossad, and I think most Americans do, as an effective Israeli intelligence organization. They rate Cuban intelligence as among the best in the entire world. That's Mossad doing that assessment. They're not a pro-Cuba organization. Cuba has been engaged in the most significant espionage cases imaginable, including Ana Bolén, Rocha, and these other cases. But beyond that, they are involved with these influencers. It's below the radar screen. It's been very sophisticated. It's been very effective. It has been certainly the source of infiltration throughout Latin America and support from its inception. So to minimize this, and I'm not saying Michael is, it is a security threat to its neighbors, and it's a security threat to the United States. In fact, most observers, and I hope Michael agrees with this, agree that the Maduro government would not have been able to be sustained had it not been for Cuban agents and Cuban support. Ask any Venezuelan about Cubans. They detest Cuban infiltration into Venezuela. If that's not a threat to our interests, right, I don't know what is.
I do want to get to how we got to this point, because you were mentioning the decades of history, of course, 60 years of resisting the U.S. government. Of course, Marco Rubio recently calling Cuba a national security issue. Matthew Torres takes a look at how we got here. Take a listen.
Havana still has this embassy in Washington, despite a fraught history between the neighbors. Relations have declined again under the second Trump administration. The Cuban president has accused the U.S. of genocide after the White House cut off its oil supply, making difficult living conditions even more dire. To understand their relationship, we go back to 1898. That's when the U.S. helped end Spanish colonial rule in Cuba, but it continued occupying the island. In 1901, the Platt Amendment finally gave Cuba independence. It also allowed the U.S. to intervene in its affairs and establish a naval base at Guantanamo Bay. Soon, U.S. investment was pouring into Cuba's lucrative sugar industry. The U.S. military was sent to protect harvests. During Prohibition, it became a playground for wealthy tourists from the U.S. Many Cubans started to resent the situation. The collapse of the sugar trade and discontent with the Cuban government sparked political unrest, and in 1934, the U.S. backed a military coup led by Fulgencio Batista. He seized power in 1952, suspended the Constitution, and canceled elections. In 1959, revolutionaries overthrew the U.S.-backed dictatorship. U.S. officials recognized a new government under Fidel Castro's rule, despite some concerns over his communist rhetoric. Relations deteriorated after Castro made the Soviet Union an ally and nationalized U.S.-owned businesses. Washington responded by imposing an embargo on most exports. One day after Castro declared Cuba a socialist state, CIA-trained Cuban exiles carried out the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. In 1962, the U.S. was on the brink of nuclear war when the Soviet Union put nuclear missiles in Cuba. The Cold War standoff ended after Moscow agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for U.S. withdrawal of missiles from Turkey.
Today,
then, after decades of hostility, Presidents Barack Obama and Raul Castro announced they wanted to restore diplomatic ties. Embassies reopened, travel restrictions eased, and commercial flights resumed. Much of that progress was reversed after Trump took office. His administration tightened sanctions, restricted travel, and redesignated Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism. President Joe Biden later eased some of those restrictions. But when President Trump returned for his second term, he once again ramped up pressures on Cuba and even threatened to take it over. He calls the country a national security threat. Cuba's economy has long struggled, partly because of state mismanagement. And the trade embargo imposed in the 60s is still in place today. The U.S. oil blockade happening now has Cuban families struggling to survive. It is harder to find work. The blackouts are more common, and water and medicine are in short supply. Matthew Torres, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Just a few moments ago, Michael, you mentioned a potential migration crisis. On the humanitarian front, how dire could the consequences be if this continues? How bad have they been so far?
Well, we know that even before this phase of tightening the screws and the blockade, which started after the Maduro capture, that a significant part of the population, especially of young people, Cubans, have been leaving over the last couple of years. About 10% of all Cubans have left. So there already has been a tremendous exodus of Cubans. And of course, if things really, really collapse completely, then we could expect even a greater flood of Cubans. And that could be very complicated for the United States to deal with. I mean, the problem is
to both the U.S. and to elsewhere in Latin America.
Elsewhere in Latin America, yeah. And so that would be an enormous problem. And I think this is something that the administration has to be bearing in mind and considering as it looks at different options of what to do in Cuba.
Taking economic action, applying sanctions in a way that really affects the common citizen of different countries, Adolfo has a spotty record at best. You were just talking about the strength of some of the security services. So why does the U.S. government feel that the political system, that the security apparatus is brittle enough, fragile enough, that these kinds of economic actions could lead to their downfall?
For a couple of reasons. We haven't seen the situation where a country is now in 20-hour blackouts and it's out of fuel and the entire grid is collapsing. And there's a point where even the security apparatuses will be unable to continue. That's key. But let me say something about exodus from Cuba and these failed Biden and Obama efforts. In 2021, July of 2021, in the Biden administration, there was a massive crackdown. That's what the weak policies of appeasement led. A massive crackdown of dissidents in Cuba, which the Biden administration did nothing about. In the course of the Biden administration, 1 million people fled Cuba. So that was the result of those policies. And why is that, Alex? Because the money that goes to the tourism and the flights and the so-called humanitarian efforts, they're all siphoned off by a couple of organizations called GIASA and Orbit SA. The government takes this, the military runs it, and the Cuban people are denied the assets. So one way or the other, the Cuban people aren't going to receive resources. If Cuba receives relief, it will be relief for the elite class that rules the country and the military. If it doesn't receive relief, everyone will suffer, including the military, and hopefully that will bring about a change. A massive migration crisis, if it's organized by the Cuban government, similar to 1980, will result in American intervention. And Cuba knows it. And that's why they have restrained its own people. But ultimately, the only thing that will work are sanctions. I'm always surprised that my liberal friends certainly didn't have that concern for the South African people when we imposed sanctions on South Africa. People live in South Africa, too. And at that time, they didn't seem to mind about having sanctions imposed on that country. So ultimately, this is the only tool we have short of military intervention, which I do not think is in the cards.
How do you think, Michael, that this is playing back here with the American people. We've seen the support for the war in Iran absolutely plummet, including among MAGA Republicans. Do you think the conversation over Cuba has a role in some of these political conversations as we look towards the midterms? Do you think that there's an appetite from the American people for the U.S. to have another excursion, to borrow President Trump's phrasing?
I don't think it's a huge issue in domestic politics in the elections, with the exception of Miami and Florida, of course, where it is an important issue. But I think it plays into a larger narrative in the sense that Iran, I think what's been revealed and what I think American people are very frustrated by is that there's no plan. There's been no real communication about what the United States is doing, what the strategy is. Is there a plan for Cuba? I'm not clear. Does the administration have a plan for Cuba? What does it expect to happen, applying all this pressure, squeezing Cuba? And then what? What happens? How does this pressure and use of coercion result in something better for the Cuban people, and that's in U.S. interest? I think there are real serious questions about that. So it plays into a narrative about competence in the management of foreign policy, and I think there, Iran and Cuba, there are some similarities.
That is a very big question, and that's one that we're going to have to leave for the next discussion. Gentlemen, thank you both for coming
we work together. You know that? We work together.
And, and you can tell, great camaraderie. Thank you so much. Adolfo Franco and Michael Shifter. Appreciate you coming in.
Thank you very much.
And I'm Alex Marquardt. That's all from me and the team here in Washington. Handing it back to Matthew Torres and Al Jazeera's global headquarters in Doha.
Thanks, Alex. We'll have another edition of This is America tomorrow at 18:30 GMT or 2:30 p.m. Eastern here in the U.S. We'll see you then.